From Doctor to Dictator, the rise and fall of Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad's journey from a soft-spoken doctor to one of the most infamous dictators of the 21st century is a saga of shattered promises, relentless oppression, and catastrophic consequences. Once seen as a symbol of hope for a modern and progressive Syria, Assad's early years in power were marked by carefully curated appearances of reform, moderation, and an ambition to lead his country onto a brighter path. The world watched with cautious optimism as the young leader, a London-educated ophthalmologist with a seemingly genteel demeanor, and his glamorous wife, Asmar, a former investment banker, presented themselves as a modern power couple ready to reshape Syria. The veneer of progress, however, masked a far darker reality. Beneath the polished surface lay the dormant machinery of authoritarianism, inherited from his father's brutal legacy, waiting to be reactivated at the first sign of dissent. Over time, Bashar al-Assad's leadership descended into a nightmare of mass imprisonment, state-sanctioned torture, chemical attacks, and relentless violence. His regime turned Syria into a dystopian state where fear and repression reigned supreme, crushing any opposition with ruthless efficiency. The son who once sought to distance himself from his father's notorious reputation would go on to outdo him in sheer brutality, presiding over one of the bloodiest chapters in modern history. The Arab Spring in 2011, which began with a flicker of hope for democratic change, would instead unleash a torrent of violence as Assad clung to power at all costs. His reign of terror would last over 2 decades, leaving a shattered nation in its wake. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, over 500,000 lives were lost, and millions were displaced, turning Syria into a symbol of human suffering. Despite international condemnation and calls for him to step down, Assad's iron grip endured for years, sustained by a web of foreign alliances with powers like Russia and Iran. Yet even his brutal tactics and external support could not insulate his regime from eventual collapse. After years of civil war, international isolation, and the erosion of his military, Assad's hold on power finally crumbled, bringing an end to half a century of Assad family rule. The fall of Bashar al-Assad is more than just the story of a dictator's demise. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, the devastating impact of authoritarianism, and the long-lasting scars left on a nation betrayed by its leadership. It marks the end of an era that not only reshaped Syria but redrew the political map of the Middle East, leaving behind a fractured state, a traumatized population, and an uncertain future. The early promise. In 2000, Bashar al-Assad rose to power following the death of his father, Hafez al-Assad, a leader whose name had become a byword for unrelenting brutality and repression. The transition marked the dawn of what many hoped would be a new chapter for Syria, as Bashar initially appeared to be a stark contrast to his father. A trained ophthalmologist with a quiet demeanor, educated in London, and married to Asmar Ulakraz, a polished British Syrian investment banker, Bashar seemed to embody the promise of modernity. He appeared, at least on the surface, to be an unlikely successor to the iron-fisted rule that Hafez had wielded for decades. Western leaders, including then British Prime Minister Tony Blair, eagerly engaged with him, seeing in Bashar a reformer who could usher Syria onto a more progressive path. His early public relations efforts painted a picture of a young, dynamic leader intent on steering his country away from the harsh autocracy of the past. During the initial years of his presidency, Bashar signaled intentions for change, offering glimmers of hope to both Syrians and the international community. He released a number of political prisoners, primarily communists, in a widely publicized presidential amnesty that was portrayed as a gesture of goodwill. Economic liberalization became a key talking point, with promises to open up Syria's stagnant economy and replace unpopular state monopolies with private enterprise. The Assad family sought to rebrand their rule, projecting an image of accessibility and modernization. Asmar's high-profile charitable initiatives and the couple's westernized lifestyle were carefully highlighted, further fueling the narrative of a new Syria under Bashar's leadership. Yet, beneath this carefully constructed facade of reform, the reality was far bleaker. The political prisoners who were released were a drop in the ocean compared to those continuously detained. The much-hyped economic liberalization disproportionately benefited a crony elite, exacerbating inequality rather than addressing systemic issues. And while the regime spoke of reform, the machinery of repression remained firmly in place, lurking beneath the surface and ready to crush any dissent. The security apparatus that Hafez had meticulously built, a vast network of intelligence agencies, secret police, and informants, continued to operate with ruthless efficiency. Even as Bashar courted the West with promises of progress, the foundations of Syria's police state remained untouched, ensuring that the authoritarian playbook of his father would persist. Bashar's early presidency, while cloaked in promises of transformation, was ultimately a continuation of the Assad dynasty's iron grip over Syria. The PR-savvy leader who spoke the language of reform and modernization soon revealed himself to be a custodian of the same oppressive system, setting the stage for the darker and more brutal chapters of his rule. Inherited brutality. Hafez al-Assad's legacy of violence cast a long and oppressive shadow over Syria. Rising to power in 1970 following years of Ba'athist political maneuvering, Hafez solidified his rule through relentless force and fear. From his role in the 1963 Ba'athist coup that brought the party to power, to the infamous 1982 Hama massacre, he built a regime sustained by an unyielding apparatus of terror. His philosophy was stark and uncompromising: all opposition, no matter its nature or scale, must be eradicated with overwhelming violence. The Hama massacre became the ultimate expression of this doctrine. When an uprising led by the Muslim Brotherhood threatened his grip, Hafez responded with an indiscriminate scorched earth campaign, unleashing land and aerial assaults that left tens of thousands dead and an entire city in ruins. This event would not only define his rule but also set a precedent for the family's philosophy of governance. When Bashar al-Assad inherited power in 2000, he did not just embrace his father's ethos of violent repression, he amplified it, elevating it to unprecedented levels. In his early years, Bashar adopted rhetoric that sought to justify the use of extreme measures, particularly against Islamist factions, often referencing his father's harsh policies as necessary to maintain order. This chilling worldview came into full force during the Arab Spring of 2011, a moment when peaceful demonstrations across the Arab world called for democratic reform and an end to autocratic rule. In Syria, however, those calls were met with unparalleled brutality. What began as sporadic protests against the Assad regime quickly grew into a widespread uprising, and Bashar's response was immediate and savage. Security forces under his brother Mayor al-Assad fired live ammunition into crowds of unarmed demonstrators, sending a clear message that dissent would not be tolerated. Pro-regime militias, known as the Shabahar, were unleashed to operate as death squads, engaging in systematic killings, massacres, and other atrocities designed to instill terror. When brute force proved insufficient to quell the uprising, the Assad regime escalated its tactics, deploying chemical weapons against civilians in rebel-held areas. The attacks in places like Khan al-Assal and Ghouta in 2013 were particularly horrifying, with hundreds killed in moments, leaving survivors to grapple with the devastating aftermath of sarin gas exposure. Beyond the battlefield, Bashar's regime turned detention centers into sites of unspeakable horror. Prisons like Sednayer became infamous for their systematic use of torture, starvation, and mass executions. Between 2011 and 2015, up to 13,000 prisoners, many of them political dissidents, activists, or simply individuals suspected of opposition, were executed at Sednayer, earning it the grim moniker, human slaughterhouse. Survivors' testimonies and smuggled documents painted a harrowing picture of industrialized killing, with bodies disposed of en masse in secret crematoriums to erase evidence of the atrocities. Under Bashar's watch, the Assad family's legacy of violence reached its zenith. If Hafez's reign was defined by episodic bursts of brutality, Bashar's rule institutionalized repression on a scale that was both systematic and unrelenting. What began as a calculated effort to crush dissent turned into one of the most devastating humanitarian crises of the modern era, leaving Syria scarred by unimaginable suffering and destruction. A nation unravels. The Arab Spring protests that began as a call for reform quickly escalated into a full-scale nationwide uprising against the Assad regime. In cities like Dara, Damascus, and Homs, civilians took to the streets demanding democratic change, freedom from decades of repression, and an end to the Assad family's authoritarian rule. These protests were initially peaceful, inspired by similar movements sweeping the Arab world. However, the regime's response was immediate, ruthless, and uncompromising. Security forces opened fire on unarmed demonstrators, arrested thousands, and implemented a campaign of systematic torture to instill fear and suppress dissent. Despite these brutal measures, the protests grew, fueled by widespread anger over Bashar al-Assad's unrelenting repression. What began as a grassroots protest movement rapidly spiraled into a nationwide revolution and, eventually, a devastating civil war. Assad's forces, bolstered by militias such as the Shabahar, waged a campaign of terror across Syria. The Shabahar, notorious for their loyalty to the Assad family and their brutality, acted as death squads, raiding villages, committing massacres, and instilling fear through indiscriminate violence. Their operations blurred the line between official state security forces and paramilitary enforcers, allowing the regime to maintain plausible deniability while perpetuating atrocities. By 2012, the situation had deteriorated into a bloody civil war that would go on to claim over 500,000 lives and displace more than half of Syria's population, both internally and across borders. Entire cities, like Aleppo, were reduced to rubble, while once thriving communities were destroyed in the crossfire of battles between regime forces, opposition groups, and extremist factions. The conflict became even more complex and devastating with the rise of ISIS in northern Syria in 2013. Exploiting the chaos, the Islamic State established a self-proclaimed caliphate centered in Raqqa, imposing a reign of terror marked by mass executions, enslavement, and barbaric punishments. International attention shifted sharply away from Assad's atrocities to focus on the existential threat posed by ISIS. This sudden shift in global priorities granted Assad a critical reprieve. Despite his regime's well-documented use of chemical weapons, including the sarin gas attacks in places like Khan al-Assad and Ghouta in 2013, the world's focus on defeating ISIS overshadowed calls for Assad's accountability. The international community's failure to take decisive action against Assad further emboldened his regime. In 2012, US President Barack Obama had drawn a red line, warning that the use of chemical weapons would provoke a strong response. However, when the Assad regime crossed that line with the Ghouta attack, killing hundreds of civilians in one of the most chilling events of the war, the promised consequences never materialized. The lack of enforcement not only weakened global credibility but also sent a clear signal to Assad that his actions would face little more than condemnation. This emboldened his regime to continue its use of chemical weapons in subsequent years, further escalating the humanitarian crisis and prolonging the war. Amid this chaos, Syria descended into a fractured battlefield, with regional and international actors vying for influence. Russia and Iran doubled down on their support for Assad, providing military and financial aid that bolstered his faltering regime. By contrast, Western powers struggled to unify their response, with some backing moderate opposition groups while others focused solely on the fight against ISIS. These competing agendas fractured Syria further, creating a multifaceted conflict that devastated the nation and left its future uncertain. The role of external actors. Assad's survival during Syria's darkest years can largely be attributed to the unwavering support of his foreign backers, whose interventions turned the tide of the war and ensured the regime's longevity. Chief among them was Russia, under Vladimir Putin, who saw in Syria an opportunity to expand Moscow's influence in the Middle East and reassert itself as a global power broker. In 2015, as Assad's forces faltered and the regime's grip on key territories weakened, Russia launched a decisive military intervention. Deploying airstrikes, advanced weaponry, and military advisors, Russian forces provided Assad with a critical lifeline. These interventions were not limited to mere military support, they included diplomatic maneuvers at the United Nations and beyond, shielding Assad's regime from international sanctions and accountability for war crimes. By positioning itself as the key player in Syria's conflict, Russia cemented its presence in the region, gaining strategic access to the Mediterranean and securing its naval base in Tartus while projecting its influence on a global scale. Iran, too, played an indispensable role in keeping Assad in power, motivated by its regional ambitions and ideological commitment to supporting Hezbollah, its proxy force in Lebanon. For Tehran, the survival of Assad's regime was essential to maintaining its axis of resistance against Israel and countering Sunni rivals like Saudi Arabia. Iran poured billions of dollars into Syria, funding Assad's military campaigns and providing weapons, logistical support, and intelligence. It also deployed its elite Quds force, led by General Qasem Soleimani, to oversee operations on the ground. Thousands of Iranian Revolutionary Guards and militia fighters from across the region, including Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, were sent to bolster Assad's forces, ensuring the regime's survival in key battles like Aleppo and Homs. Meanwhile, Hezbollah fighters crossed the border from Lebanon to take part in some of the war's most brutal offensives, further solidifying Iran's influence in Syria. These alliances proved to be a game-changer for Assad. Russian air power decimated opposition strongholds, obliterating cities like Aleppo in relentless bombardments that killed thousands of civilians. Iran's ground forces provided the manpower Assad's depleted army desperately needed, helping the regime regain critical territory. Together, these foreign powers stabilized Assad's rule in crucial areas, even as he lost control of large swathes of the country to opposition factions, Kurdish forces, and ISIS. Their involvement also shifted the balance of the war, transforming Assad's regime from a crumbling dictatorship to a dependent client state, heavily reliant on its patrons for survival. However, this support came at a steep cost. Russia and Iran's backing did not stem from altruism. Both powers extracted significant concessions from the Assad regime. Russia gained access to Syria's natural resources, military bases, and lucrative reconstruction contracts, cementing its foothold in the region for decades to come. Iran expanded its influence across Syrian institutions, reshaping the country's demographics through forced displacements and sectarian militias loyal to Tehran. These foreign interventions also alienated much of Syria's population, who saw Assad as a puppet of outside powers, further deepening the fractures within the country. Despite the stabilization achieved in some areas, Assad's reliance on foreign backers highlighted the fragility of his regime. By the war's later years, Syria had effectively been carved into zones of influence controlled by competing powers. In the north, Turkey established its own protectorates, while US-backed Kurdish forces controlled much of the northeast. In other regions, the remnants of opposition groups clung to survival. Assad's own authority was confined to the territories secured by Russian and Iranian forces, rendering him a figurehead presiding over a deeply fragmented and war-ravaged nation. His survival, far from being a testament to his leadership, underscored the dependency and vulnerability of a regime propped up by external powers, whose competing agendas left Syria as a battlefield for international rivalries. A failed state. By the mid-2010s, Syria had descended into a fractured and chaotic state, with the Assad regime holding onto power by a thread. The country, once a bastion of centralized control under Bashar's father, Hafez, had splintered into a patchwork of territories ruled by a mix of foreign powers, rebel factions, and extremist groups. The Assad regime controlled a mere 25% of its territory, and its grip was maintained largely due to the military interventions of its backers, Russia and Iran. What was once a unified nation had been balkanized into zones of influence, each governed by competing interests. In the north, Turkish-backed militias established protectorates, while in the east, American-supported Kurdish forces carved out their own semi-autonomous territories. Meanwhile, extremist factions like ISIS briefly created a self-proclaimed caliphate in the north, further complicating the already dire situation. What remained under Assad's control was little more than a collection of urban strongholds and key strategic areas, held together by foreign military and financial support rather than any semblance of domestic unity. The dysfunction within the Assad regime became increasingly apparent as the civil war dragged on, eroding not just its territorial control but also its administrative and military capacities. Once hailed as one of the region's most formidable armies, Syria's military was reduced to a shell of its former self. Decimated by years of defections, casualties, and demoralization, it became heavily reliant on foreign militias supplied by Iran and air support from Russia to conduct its operations. The army's collapse symbolized the broader deterioration of state institutions, leaving much of the country in a state of lawlessness and despair. Amidst this turmoil, the personal lives of Bashar and his family painted a stark contrast to the suffering endured by ordinary Syrians. Leaked emails exposed a regime detached from the horrific reality it had created. As Syrians endured unimaginable hardship, caught between barrel bombs, chemical attacks, and grinding poverty, Bashar's wife, Asmar, indulged in extravagant shopping sprees. Emails revealed her purchasing expensive jewelry, designer furniture, and luxury items from Paris and London, reinforcing the perception of a ruling family isolated from the plight of its people. Even as their regime orchestrated mass killings and systematic torture in places like Sednaya prison, the Assads attempted to maintain an image of normalcy. Asmar's public appearances were carefully curated to depict her as a modern and compassionate figure, a stark contrast to the regime's atrocities. Bashar, too, sought to legitimize his rule through a series of sham elections, most notably in 2014, held under the banner of Sowar, unity. These elections, conducted in areas still under regime control, were widely condemned as a farce by the international community. The outcome was never in doubt, with Assad winning an implausible majority. But the attempt to project an image of legitimacy fooled no one. The elections only underscored the regime's desperation to cling to power, even as it presided over a nation in ruins. The contradictions within the Assad regime were stark. On the one hand, it projected an air of normalcy and resilience, organizing events and showcasing a seemingly stable leadership. On the other, the realities of life under Assad's rule were defined by devastation, mass displacement, and systemic violence. The regime's atrocities were impossible to hide, and its attempts to distract the world with glossy PR campaigns and superficial reforms fell flat. By the mid-2010s, Syria under Assad had become a cautionary tale, a once proud nation reduced to rubble, its government propped up by foreign powers and characterized by corruption, brutality, and indifference to human suffering. The fall. In 2023, the Assad regime finally collapsed under the weight of its own corruption, brutality, and decades of mismanagement. Years of civil war had battered Syria into a failed state, leaving its military and security apparatus demoralized, overstretched, and utterly dependent on foreign backers for survival. For years, Bashar al-Assad had relied on the support of Russia and Iran to prop up his crumbling regime, but by 2023, those alliances began to falter. Russia, embroiled in its protracted and costly war in Ukraine, found itself unable to maintain the same level of military and financial support for Assad's forces. Simultaneously, Iran, grappling with growing domestic unrest and economic instability, saw its influence in Syria wane. Without the lifeline provided by these allies, Assad was left exposed, his regime teetering on the edge of collapse. This vacuum of power created the perfect storm for long-simmering grievances and insurgencies to reignite. Years of oppression, economic deprivation, and unchecked corruption had alienated the Syrian populace, leaving vast swathes of the country in rebellion. A jihadist insurgency, fueled by the chaos and despair of Assad's rule, gained momentum, taking advantage of the regime's weakened state. Emboldened by the regime's inability to respond effectively, insurgents swept through key territories with startling speed. The final blow came when the insurgency reached Damascus, overwhelming the remaining loyalist forces. After more than 50 years of iron-fisted Assad family rule, the regime crumbled, marking the end of an era that had defined Syria's modern history. The collapse of Assad's regime was not merely the result of external pressures but also a consequence of its own inherent fragility. As Hassan Hassan, editor-in-chief of New Lines magazine, aptly noted, Assad's downfall was the inevitable outcome of a state hollowed out by systemic corruption and incompetence. For decades, the Assad family had governed Syria through fear, violence, and a patronage network that enriched the elite while impoverishing the masses. The regime's brutality during the civil war, characterized by mass killings, chemical attacks, and the industrial-scale torture of dissidents, left the country fractured and its social fabric in tatters. By 2023, Syria was no longer a unified nation but a patchwork of territories controlled by competing factions and foreign powers. The Assad regime, unable to govern effectively, had essentially mortgaged the country's sovereignty to its backers in Moscow and Tehran. This dependence on external forces not only eroded Syria's autonomy but also made the regime's survival contingent on the shifting priorities of its allies. When those allies began to retreat, Assad's carefully constructed facade of strength and control crumbled, exposing the regime's vulnerabilities to the world. The fall of Damascus symbolized the culmination of decades of failed governance, brutal repression, and catastrophic miscalculations. The once mighty Assad dynasty, which had ruled Syria with an iron grip since 1970, was reduced to a cautionary tale of how absolute power, unchecked, can ultimately lead to collapse. The aftermath of the regime's fall left Syria in a state of uncertainty and chaos, its people facing the monumental challenge of rebuilding a nation shattered by half a century of authoritarianism and over a decade of devastating war. The world watched as the Assad era came to an end, offering both a moment of reckoning and a glimmer of hope for a country long trapped in the shadow of tyranny. A legacy of blood and ash. Bashar al-Assad's rule stands as one of the most tragic and devastating chapters in Syria's modern history. What began with the promise of reform, modernization, and a break from the oppressive legacy of his father, Hafez al-Assad, quickly unraveled into a nightmare of brutality, repression, and unthinkable atrocities. Bashar's early overtures of change, his release of political prisoners, his promises of economic liberalization, and his carefully curated image as a Western-educated reformer, were ultimately a facade, concealing a regime as ruthless and authoritarian as any in the world. Under his watch, Syria became a byword for state-sponsored terror, with infamous atrocities like the industrialized torture of Sednaya prison and the chemical attacks on Ghouta standing as grim symbols of his reign. For over 2 decades, Bashar clung to power through a combination of calculated brutality, foreign alliances, and propaganda, all while presiding over a country steadily descending into chaos. The civil war that erupted during the Arab Spring spiraled into a conflict of unimaginable scale, reducing Syria to rubble and claiming the lives of over 500,000 people. Entire cities were flattened, ancient heritage sites destroyed, and millions of Syrians displaced, creating one of the worst humanitarian crises of the 21st century. Bashar's systematic targeting of his own people, from barrel bombs dropped on residential neighborhoods to the starvation sieges of rebel-held areas, exposed the horrifying depths to which his regime was willing to sink in order to maintain its grip on power. The eventual downfall of the Assad regime leaves Syria a fractured and devastated nation, its society deeply scarred by decades of oppression and war. The collapse of 50 years of Assad family rule marks the end of an era, but it comes at an immense cost. Syria is now a nation in ruins, grappling with destroyed infrastructure, a shattered economy, and a population traumatized by years of violence and repression. The scars left by Bashar's dictatorship, both physical and psychological, will take generations to heal, and the path to rebuilding will be fraught with immense challenges. Yet, within the ruins lies a glimmer of hope. The end of the Assad era, while born of immense suffering, offers Syria a chance to rebuild from the ground up. It is an opportunity for the Syrian people to reclaim their agency, to create a society founded on justice, dignity, and freedom, values that were systematically crushed under the weight of the Assad dynasty. But the journey forward will not be easy. The legacy of repression, corruption, and sectarianism will haunt Syria for years to come, serving as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the catastrophic consequences of authoritarian rule. Bashar al-Assad's story is not just the tale of a failed leader but a cautionary lesson for the world. It serves as a powerful reminder of how even the most polished promises of reform can mask the soul of a tyrant. His rise and fall encapsulate the fragility of hope when placed in the hands of those unwilling to relinquish control, and his reign stands as a warning against the perils of absolute power. For Syria, the road to recovery will be long and arduous, but the fall of the Assad regime opens the door to a future where the country can finally break free from the shadow of tyranny and begin the long process of healing and rebuilding.